140 Girl Scouts arrived at camp for a 2-week adventure in the wilderness. They were looking forward to swimming, fishing, boating, hiking, singing around the campfire, sleeping in tents, and making new friends. The first night of camp, the tents were full of giggling, excited, loud little girls. Some wrote letters home, and they got to know each other. Even though bedtime was at 9 o'clock, some girls inside their tents didn't quiet down until 1:30 a.m. The next morning, a camp counselor woke up early at 6 o'clock to try to get in a warm shower before the girls awoke for the day. However, on the way to the shower, she saw 3 sleeping bags along the trail with a body alongside them. They would soon discover the bodies of 2 other girls inside the sleeping bags. These 3 girls had lost their lives during the night. How were they murdered in a campground with multiple other campers and counselors nearby? And no one heard a thing. Hi, I'm Mindy. Welcome to the Missing Link channel. Each murder and unsolved mystery is just one missing link away from being solved. Hit the subscribe button so you won't miss a video and help us find that missing link. So when I first chose this case to research, I had no idea how in-depth this case would be. There were so many details that I didn't want to leave out. My notes ended up being over 29 pages long. So this video will likely be split up into 2 or 3 parts, but I will release them close together, probably just a couple days apart. This just means you'll get extra videos for the month of October. I had planned to record at least 8 videos this month, maybe closer to 10, and the extra videos on this case will just be in addition to those. So let's get right into it. This story took place at Camp Scott, located 2 miles southeast of Locust Grove, Oklahoma, and 50 miles from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Camp Scott opened in 1928. When this crime took place in 1977, they had been hosting camps for almost 50 years. The camp was used by the Girl Scouts year-round and welcomed Girl Scouts from 2nd grade all the way up to seniors in high school. There were multiple 2-week sessions throughout the summer. The camp is located in the dense woods. It was located on a ridge overlooking a valley with the Snake Creek below. The camp is located in the country, so no light from the city helped brighten the night sky. Instead, it was extremely dark at night in this area. The camp was split up into 10 campgrounds or units. The girls in each campground or unit was determined based on school grade level and age. Here is a photo of the entire camp. The campgrounds or units were named after Indian tribes, such as Cherokee, Arapaho, Kiowa, Comanche, and Chickasaw. Each campground had a various number of tents inside of it. In Kiowa, there were 8 tents, 1 for the camp counselors, and 7 tents for the Girl Scouts. The director and camp counselors referred to the counselors' tent by this name and numbered the girls' tents number 1 through number 7. They even referred to it this way in court during the preliminary hearing. For some reason, the number associated with the tents changed over time. They started referring to the counselors' tent as tent number 1 and called the campers' tents numbers 2 through 8. So I will refer to the counselor's tent as tent number 1 and the campers' tents in the same way, 2 through 8. Here is a photo showing how the campground was arranged. You can see the counselor's tent was located on the southern end of the camp, with tent number 2 to its left, and then following along a half-circle pattern. Directly across from the counselor's tent on the north end is tent number 8. The counselor's tent and tent number 8 were located 79 yards apart, with a building in the middle. The latrine was located past tent number 8. The tents vary in distances from each other. Tent number 7 looks to be approximately 15 yards from tent number 8. The tents were raised on wood platforms with 2 wooden steps to climb and canvas sides, which could be rolled up at night or in bad weather. These tents were 12 feet wide and 14 feet deep. Inside each tent were 4 cots. Strange things happened in Camp Scott during the years leading up to the crime. The year before this case, in 1976, there were 3 mothers sleeping inside one tent. Apparently, an intruder entered their tent one night. A camp employee named Ben did an investigation, and this intruder was never found. A few months before these Girl Scouts arrived, in April of 1977, there was an event for older Girl Scouts. Junior high girls were at the camp, and high school girls were helping out. A high school girl discovered her belongings in her tent had been gone through. She had donuts in a box, but the donuts had been removed and replaced with a note. The note stated that 3 campers would be murdered in tent 1. The note also talked about UFOs and extraterrestrials. The note was just thrown away. Instead of taking the note seriously, this was determined to either be a hoax or just a prank. At one point, a girl thought she saw a dummy hanging in the trees. However, upon further investigation, it was determined that it was just a kid's imagination playing tricks on her. It was just tree limbs hanging across other tree limbs, which looked like a dummy hanging in the trees. An actual dummy was never located. On Sunday, June 12, 1977, about 2:00 p.m., 140 Girl Scouts loaded buses in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for the drive to Camp Scott. Most of these girls were from the Tulsa area. It was a beautiful, sunny day. The buses were full of talking, giggling, and singing little girls, so excited to start their 2-week adventure together in the Oklahoma wilderness. One girl, Denise Milner, age 10, was pretty nervous since she had never spent the night away from home before. She sat on the bus with an older girl, age 15, named Michelle Hoffman, that had been attending camp since 2nd grade. The girls on the bus sang campfire songs, giggled, and got to know each other. As the bus went underneath the Camp Scott sign and drove down the tree-lined road into the camp, the bus quieted down. And the girls were taking it all in, everything they could see. Not long before the girls arrived, Ben, who worked at the camp, noticed that there was a cut in one of the tents in the Kiowa campground. There was a 4 to 5 foot part missing. This was tent number 7. He didn't believe that this damage could have been caused from a storm. However, the camp didn't usually have problems with trespassers. He wondered if they had time to replace the tent, but instead, the tent was repaired. The camp had a wooden gate at the entrance and fences around the property. The gate was left open and unlocked when residents were not present. However, When camp was in session, the gate was closed and locked each evening. There were only 2 keys, one held by Ben and the other by Barbara, the director. The fences at the camp didn't seem like they were built to stop anyone from coming onto the property. Perhaps the fences were just a land marker to show what land was part of the camp. There were landline phones at the camp. There was at least one in the director's cabin. Usually, the staff would communicate by walkie-talkies. However, that Sunday, the walkie-talkies were not working. Someone was coming the following day to fix them. So that Sunday, the only form of communication between staff members was speaking in person. Back at the front of the camp, the girls were getting off the buses and finding out their assigned units. Then they headed with their counselors to the campgrounds. About 3:30, 27 little girls headed to the Kiowa campground with 3 counselors. Dee Elder, the unit leader, Carla Wilhite, and Susan Emery. They headed to their kitchen area. It is tradition at camp for the girls to choose their tent mates, usually 4, and they also get to choose their tent. Some of the Girl Scouts came to camp with friends or girls from their troops, and these girls usually choose to bunk together in the same tent. The girls' belongings were brought down to the unit, and they took them inside their tents that would be their home for the next 14 days. Michelle Hoffman, who sat next to Denise on the bus, came to check on her in the Kiowa campground. When she noticed that Denise was in tent number 8, she was so excited for her. She told Denise that she had stayed in that very tent before, and it was one of her favorites because it was so close to the bathroom, campground, and kitchen. Denise introduced Michelle to her 2 tent mates, Michelle Gousset, age 9, and Lori Farmer, age 8. Michelle Hoffman told Denise, "Good night, see you in the morning." About 5:45, the girls headed to the Great Hall for dinner. It was cloudy outside, but wasn't raining on their walk there. The girls enjoyed their first dinner at camp. I am sure that Great Hall was again filled with laughter and talking from the girls. After dinner, all the Girl Scouts sat on the porch of the Great Hall and sang campfire songs for about 10 to 15 minutes. The singing was cut short because the clouds opened up and it started to rain. The girls were told to follow their counselor back to their units. By the time the girls got back to Kiowa, they were soaked. The counselors told the girls to go inside their tents and get on dry clothes. While the girls did this, the counselors went around to each tent to hook the sides down so the tent wouldn't blow during the storm. They didn't want anything inside the tent to get wet. The girls also had some quiet time alone in their tents with their tent mates. The 3 tent mates in tent number 8 didn't know each other until that day. Individually, they were very quiet, but soon their tent was just as loud and lively as the rest of the tents. The 3 girls in tent number 8 wrote letters. Denise Milner, age 10, wrote, "Dear Mom, I don't like camp. It's awful. The first day it rained. I have 3 new friends named Glenda, Lori, and Michelle. Michelle and Lori are my roommates. Mom, I don't want to stay at camp 2 weeks. I want to come home and see Cassie and everybody. Your loving child, Denise Milner." Michelle Gousset, age 9, wrote, "Dear Aunt Kathy, how are you? I am fine. I am writing from camp. We can't go outside because it is storming. Me and my tent mates are in the last tent in our unit. My tent mates are Denise Milner and Lori Farmer. My room is in shades of purple. Love, Michelle. Lori Farmer, age 8, wrote, "Dear Mom and Dad and Misty and Joe and Chad and Kathy, we're just getting ready to go to bed. It's 7:45. We're at the beginning of a storm and having a lot of fun. I've met 2 new friends, Michelle Gousset and Denise Milner. I'm sharing a tent with them. It started raining on the way back from dinner. We're sleeping on cots. I couldn't wait to write. We're all writing letters now because there's hardly anything else to do. With love, Lori." Each tent houses 4 girls, but there was a mix-up and only 3 girls were in tent number 8. Another girl was supposed to be in the tent, but due to the weather, she wasn't moved that night. The girls were told to put on their rain gear and meet in the unit kitchen. The counselors took roll and talked about activities for the following day and went over the camp rules. The girls ate cookies, played a game to get to know each other, and sang songs. At 9 o'clock, the counselors told the girls to go back to their tents and get ready for bed. Sometime between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock, a counselor in the Comanche unit, which is not far from the Kiowa unit, saw a dim light moving through the woods towards Kiowa. They figured it was just one of the girls from the unit heading back for bed. Back in Kiowa, about 10 o'clock, the counselors went to each tent to check and talk to the girls. They stood in the doorway of each tent to make sure that they were doing all right, were warm, had enough blankets, and made sure they were not too homesick. The girls in tent number 8 were sleeping with their sleeping bags on top of their cots. There was no light inside the tents, but each girl brought a flashlight and extra batteries to camp from home. There continued to be a lot of noises, talking, and giggling coming from the tents. This was pretty typical for the first night of camp. The counselors would just yell at the girls from their tent to quiet down. The counselor's tent faced the girls' tents and was open in that direction. The front flap of the counselor's tent was also open so they could see out into the entire unit. But remember, there was a building between the counselor's tent and tent number 8. About 11 o'clock, one of the counselors went around to the tents and told the loud ones to be quiet. She didn't say anything to the quiet tents because she didn't want to wake them up if they were already asleep. At that time, the quiet tents were tent number 7 and tent number 8. About midnight, Carla heard laughter and noises coming from the latrine area. She got up, found girls out of bed, and took them back to tent number 2. When she passed tent number 8, all was quiet. Carla then went back to the counselor's tent. About 1:30 a.m., the counselors were awoken by giggling in tent number 5. Carla yelled at the girls and pointed her flashlight towards their tent. She also mentioned that tent number 8 was still quiet. At that time, Carla and Dee also heard sounds coming from the woods between tent number 2 and tent number 3. It sounded like a low, guttural, or moaning sound. Nothing they had ever heard before. Carla decided to check it out and pointed her flashlight into the woods. She became scared that it may be an animal, and when she couldn't figure out where the noise was coming from, she went back to her tent. Around 2 a.m., a counselor in another unit also saw a light in the woods, moving towards Kiowa. Another camper, from Camp Scott, would later describe the true darkness of this area. When she turned off her flashlight, the last light in her tent, she explained that she remembers the feeling of being swallowed up by the darkness. "It was the darkest dark I had ever known," she said. adding, "It was both a little scary and a little magical at the same time. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or shut." Gradually that night, the laughter, talking, and silliness subsided. The girls all drifted off to sleep. I am sure that the girls in tent number 8, the most isolated tent and farthest away from the counselors, fell asleep thinking about the adventures that awaited them the next 2 weeks. Swimming, fishing, boating, hiking, horseback riding, arts and crafts, singing around the campfire, sleeping in tents, and continuing to make new friends. They fell asleep in their sleeping bags. One was yellow plaid, one was dark green, and the other a red flower pattern. In a few short hours, they would be awake to an absolute nightmare. Who were these 3 little girls in tent number 8? Dolores Milner was the oldest of the 3 girls. She was born February 5th, 1967, and was 10 years old and going into the 5th grade. She was a straight A student. Her parents were divorced, and she lived with her mother and 5-year-old sister in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She loved gymnastics, tap dancing, and singing in the church choir. She also loved to make breakfast for her mother and her little sister. This was her first year as a Girl Scout. She sold enough Girl Scout cookies to attend the Girl Scout camp with friends. That was the plan. But her friends decided not to go. Denise didn't want to go alone without her friends. But her mother thought it was a great opportunity, so she talked her into going. Her mother told her that if she didn't like it, she could always come home. Carla, the camp counselor, described Denise as a beautiful and radiant child. Carla knew Denise was a first-time camper, and she wanted to make sure that she had a great time. Michelle Heather Gousset was born July 22nd, 1967, and was 9 years old. She was also going into 5th grade. She lived in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, which is a suburb of Tulsa. She lived with her parents and her brother. Michelle loved playing soccer and being a Girl Scout. This wasn't her first time at Camp Scott. She had also attended the Girl Scout camp the year before. When Michelle left home that morning, she made sure to ask her parents to water her plants. She loved African violets. Michelle was described as shy, but very lovable. These are 2 photos taken the morning Michelle left for camp. You can see her red sleeping bag in the first photo. The second photo shows a bunch of girls lining up to get on the bus to take them to Camp Scott. Lori Lee Farmer was born June 18th, 1968. She was only 8 years old. She lived with her parents and 4 younger siblings in Tulsa. Lori was very protective of her siblings. Lori was described as a bright, beautiful, brown-eyed little girl. She was the youngest girl in Kiowa. She was very mature for her age, though. She even skipped 2nd grade. She was also going into 5th grade and was a top student, even though she was the youngest in her class. She knew that she wanted to attend camp that summer, but she wasn't sure which camp she wanted to go to. She decided to either attend the Girl Scout camp or a YMCA camp. Lori's mother helped her decide on the Girl Scout camp and also chose the session that Lori would attend. Lori wasn't worried that she would be the youngest in her group at camp either. Lori's 9th birthday was going to be while she was still at camp on June 18th. Her parents were planning on driving to camp that day and celebrating with Lori. Three wonderful, talented, sweet, and beautiful little girls. Sometime during the night, a camper in tent 7 was awakened and saw a light approach her tent. Light suddenly flooded the tent, and a male figure stood in the entrance. Then the flap to the tent closed, and the figure was gone. At 3 o'clock, two separate girls from different areas of camp heard two strange things. First, a girl heard a scream coming from somewhere near the Kiowa area. Second, another girl heard a scream, and a girl crying, "Mama, Mama." Both girls weren't sure what to do. They ended up going back to sleep. The Kiowa counselors, Carla, Dee, and Susan, ended up falling asleep sometime after 1:30 a.m. and didn't hear anything unusual the rest of the night. At 6 o'clock a.m., Carla's alarm went off. She wanted to take a hot shower before the hot water ran out and before any of the girls awoke for the day. She got her shower supplies together and headed out of the tent. She went towards the staff showers. The early sunlight was beginning to shine through the trees. Along the way, not too far from her tent, about 52 yards, she saw 3 sleeping bags along the trail. One yellow plaid, one dark green, and one red flower patterned sleeping bag. Carla didn't recognize who these belonged to. She thought this was so strange and was trying to logically figure out why 3 sleeping bags would be on the trail. At first, she thought the camp employees must have been delivering more of the girls' belongings because they were missing some the day before. Maybe these sleeping bags fell out of the vehicle during this delivery. As she got a little closer, she saw an unbelievable sight. There was a body of a little girl on top of one of the sleeping bags. This girl had on a pajama top, was nude from the waist down. Her body looked battered. Her legs were spread apart, and her eyes were open. Carla didn't recognize the girl, but didn't think she was alive either. Carla ran back to her tent and awoke Dee and Susan. She yelled that they needed to do a head count of the girls in the unit. There was something wrong. There was something on the trail. Carla headed to tent number 2, and Dee headed to tent number 8. When Dee arrived at tent number 8, she pulled back the tent flap, and she didn't see anything inside. She didn't see any girls, any sleeping bags, and the mattress covers were missing as well. She thought the girls must have gotten scared and were possibly in another tent. To her surprise, she saw blood inside. She thought maybe one of the girls had had a nosebleed. She was trying to convince herself that there had to be a logical explanation of why the blood was there. They checked all the other tents and came to the realization that 3 of the girls were missing. Susan and Dee headed to where Carla said she saw the sleeping bags and the body along the trail. Susan screamed at the awful sight, and Dee reminded her not to scream because they didn't want to wake up the other girls. Dee knew they had to get the camp director, Barbara Day, and her husband Richard, and also the camp nurse, Mary Ann. Dee ran up to the camp director's cabin and started banging on the door. She ran inside, waking them up, and told them the devastating news that 3 girls were missing and 1 may be dead because they found a body on the trail not far from Kiowa. They all headed back to the scene. Barbara saw the girl's body. It was nude from the waist down. It looked like she had been hit on the right side of her head or forehead area. There was visible blood. Her hands were bound behind her back, and she was lying on one of the sleeping bags. Due to the placement of the body, They feared that she had been molested, or possibly even worse. They noticed two other sleeping bags nearby. When looking at them, it just looked like they were bunched up together. It didn't look like there was anything inside the sleeping bags. Richard was worried that one of the other girls from the camp would walk by, and he didn't want them to see this awful sight. So he moved the sleeping bag that the body was laying on and tried to cover it up. They knew 3 girls were missing, but they could only see one. Susan picked up one of the other sleeping bags, and she knew immediately that there was something inside. Richard felt the bag, and he agreed. They didn't look inside of it or touch anything else. They figured that the other 2 girls must be inside the sleeping bags. Richard and Barbara told one of the counselors to stay at the scene and make sure no one touch anything. They went to wake up the camp ranger. They instructed the other 2 counselors to hurry and wake up the other girls and take them to the dining room, but make sure to take a different trail so they didn't go by the crime scene. Barbara also called the highway patrol and the executive director of the Girl Scouts. Harold Berry, the state trooper, lived just down the road from the camp and was the first on the scene. He immediately called the sheriff when he saw the crime scene. At this point, they knew which 3 girls were missing. Denise was a body that was lying on top of the sleeping bags. Lori and Michelle were found inside their sleeping bags. Denise and Michelle had cords tied around them. Michelle had a cord wrapped around her wrist. Lori had no ties on her. Some of the girls even had duct tape on their mouths. The duct tape was a dark color, and it was described as black, rough surface adhesive tape. There was a red flashlight found next to the sleeping bags. This flashlight had part of a trash bag covering the lens, which was held by tape, and a small hole in the trash bag, probably to only let out a small amount of light. Inside the flashlight, in the battery compartment, were pieces of a Tulsa newspaper from April. About 7:30 a.m. that morning, they also examined tent number 8. When they opened up the front flap of the tent, they saw blood inside. Blood was on the cots, on the floor under the cots, and even footprints in blood, one inside the tent and one outside. At least one of the footprints looked to be from a ski boot. The blood was also smeared, as if someone had tried to clean up the blood, but all they did was manage to smear blood all over. The parents of Denise, Michelle, and Lori were notified that the girls died overnight. They had seen their daughters less than 24 hours earlier. They would miss out on watching their daughters grow up, graduate high school, get married, and become mothers of their own someday. Instead of telling the families that their daughters were murdered, they left out many details and made it seem like the girls died in an accident. Michelle's mother found out that her daughter had been murdered at the camp when she heard a reporter talking about it on the television. Remember, Lori's 9th birthday was the following weekend. Her parents and siblings were planning a birthday party for her at the camp. But now, instead of planning a birthday party, they were making arrangements for her funeral. The other Girl Scouts had been assembled in the dining room to have breakfast. Then, some girls were sent on a hike in another area, while the Kiowa girls were all interviewed to see if they had heard or seen anything. Then all the girls were sent back to Tulsa on the buses, just like when they arrived the day before. But this time, 3 little girls wouldn't be going home to their families. Parents began arriving at Girl Scout headquarters, waiting for their daughters to return. These parents knew that the families of the victims had already been notified, but they couldn't wait to see their daughters, just to make sure that they were all right. The buses started arriving about 2:15, and 137 Girl Scouts got off the buses and were greeted by their parents. There was a definite sense of relief by these parents that they were still able to hug their daughters. These Girl Scouts didn't know what happened the night before, why they were sleeping in their tents. The camp had left it up to the parents to inform their daughters. The camp didn't want to cause any panic or any anxiety before the girls were reunited with their families. This was the last day that the Girl Scouts would step foot into Camp Scott. This is where we are going to leave off for this video. In the next video, which will be posted in the next couple days, we will discuss the suspects, how one of them went to trial, and what the outcome of the trial was. In the final video, we will discuss who could have committed these crimes, what the families have done after the murders, and discuss some of the questions I have about how these murders were committed. Thank you for joining me here today. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. Also, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you'll be notified of my future videos. And follow me on social media as well. As always, have a wonderful day. Watch out for each other and keep looking for that missing link. Love ya, and see you in my next video.